to where we could start the mission. But remember, we only had 6 astronauts. So this was the second class of astronauts that were brought in because the mission load was getting heavy, and they were known as the New Nine. And they were, from the Air Force, Frank Borman, Tom Stafford, Edward White, and James McDivitt. Are these names starting to sound familiar to you now? I think they probably are. From the Navy, we got John Young, Jim Lovell, Elliot C., and Pete Conrad. And our first civilian astronaut was Neil Armstrong. Now, Neil Armstrong was a naval-trained aviator. Remember the criteria, he had to be in Naval Test Pilot School. But he left the Navy and went to NASA as a civilian test pilot. And at the time he entered the astronaut program, he was a civilian. So we had our first civilian astronaut. Gemini 3 was launched in March of 1965. 2 unmanned launches. This is the 3rd launch. First American 2-man capsule. Second flight for Grissom, first flight for Young. They accomplished many firsts on this flight. First, to change the shape of the orbit. In other words, they had to be able to maneuver the capsule. In Project Mercury, they orbited. Now they had to be able to change the shape of the orbit. They had to be able to change their altitude, to go up and to go down, and they had to be able to control the capsule during re-entry in order to have that precise landing area. So all of those were firsts that were done with the new Gemini capsule by Young and Grissom. Now, remember when we were talking about Project Mercury, we talked about there were no mission patches. And there were still no mission patches. This is a commemorative patch. But remember I said that naming the capsules would give NASA a problem. Astronauts could name their capsules. I call this the new rule flag, because Gus Grissom named his capsule the Molly Brown. Yeah. It was named after a very popular Broadway play at the time called The Unsinkable Molly Brown. And I could see you all understand the reference he was making. Well, NASA didn't like this at all, and they asked him to change it, and he said he would change it to Titanic. So they let him keep the name Molly Brown for his capsule, but they insisted on all official communications and writings that it be called Gemini 3. New rule: there would be no more naming of capsules by astronauts. This was the last capsule that was named. Now, there was something else that went on. Can you read that?
I say moon pie.
What do you think he took?
Moon pie. Mars bar. Corned beef
Corned
sandwich.
beef sandwich.
I remembered that.
What the astronauts did was, they got a ladder and they got a bunch of sandwiches, and they climbed up on the ladder and dropped the sandwiches onto some plastic to see which one produced the least debris. Well, the corned beef sandwich won, and John Young took that corned beef sandwich on the flight, and both he and Gus Grissom took a bite of it while they were flying. Well, this drove Mission Control crazy because they were afraid that the debris from the sandwich would drift into the electronics. Remember, these were not solid-state electronics we're talking about here. Plus, the medical team, which had some space foods for them to try, were upset because they thought the corned beef would upset the experiments. So, new rule. Astronauts were not allowed to take anything on their capsules that were not authorized by NASA headquarters and the director of the Manned Space Flight Center. That's why I call it the new rule flights. No more naming capsules, no more unauthorized things carried by the astronauts. Now, Gemini 4, launched in June 3rd, 1965, was our first multiple-day mission of 4 days. No bragging, the Soviets had done 5. First attempt at rendezvous. And I say attempt because it wasn't very successful. And the reasons were that we didn't understand orbital mechanics at the time. For a real brief explanation, to catch a spacecraft with another, you just don't chase it with thrust. In order to catch it, you have to go up to slow down if it's behind you, and you have to go down to speed up and then come up at the same place. That's a basic understanding of it, but we didn't know that then, and so this gave them an understanding of those orbital mechanics. Second thing was depth perception. They didn't have targeting radar on their capsule, and they were using depth perception, and they sometimes disagreed by up to 1/4 of a mile of how far away the target was. And they also determined that they needed at least 2, if not 3 lights on the target so they could determine its alignment as they approached it. So a lot of lessons learned, but they didn't get to rendezvous. And it was the first extravehicular activity, or EVA, spacewalk done by Ed White. And it was a very, very hard thing to do. His spacesuit was very stiff, and he had no way of getting around in space, no way to start his propulsion. He had no way of getting around the capsule, and it was very difficult to get back. He was overheated and exhausted, but he still wanted to stay out and had to be ordered back into the spacecraft by mission control. And yes, it is true, one of his spare gloves did drift out of the capsule and became one of the first pieces of space junk. Now, other things were happening on the ground while Gemini 4, I'm sorry, and this is a picture of Ed White. Now, let's go back to the mission patches. Gus Grissom had named his capsule. Well, James McDivitt, Ed White could not name their capsule. It was prohibited. So how were they going to personalize their mission? They were the first ones to put the American flag on their spacesuits. Up until that time, the only thing on the spacesuits was the NASA meatball and their name tag. They were the first ones to put the American flag on their spacesuits. And of course, now you see it's routine. You see the flags of all the various nations on the astronauts, but they were the first ones to do it. The Russians had CCCP across their helmets, but they did not wear national flags on their spacesuits. Well, while Gemini 4 was in space for 4 days, 1 hour and 56 minutes, things were happening on the ground. It was the first mission controlled from Houston, the Johnson Space Center. When the aircraft, when the spaceship cleared the gantry, mission control switched from Cape Canaveral Air Force Station to Houston. And of course, you're all aware that mission control is in Houston. Well, still, even today, when we have a manned launch, control is till it clears the gantry in Kennedy Space Center, and then it switches to Johnson Space Center, Houston. It was the first launch watched live internationally. Our satellite program in the United States had continued, and they had launched the Early Bird satellite, and that allowed the transmission of a live broadcast of the launch to 12 Western European nations. And finally, he got a commemorative stamp for his spacewalk. Notice it's 5 cents. Remember John Glenn was 4 cents?
Yeah.
Even in the mail right now, we're seeing inflation creeping in. Well, Gemini 5 launched in August of 1965 on orbit for 8 days. That was our first U.S. record. And that remained a record until we beat it with a 14-day mission. They worked on guidance and navigation systems. Now, how could they do an 8-day mission? Well, the restriction to the long-duration missions was power. And U.S. space capsules were operating on battery power.